The girl couldn't have been more than 11, but she looked up at Samuel Hollister with the same green eyes he had watched close forever on a blood-soaked battlefield 20 years ago. Her father had died saving his life, and now she had come to collect on a promise Samuel never thought he'd have to keep. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The autumn sun hung low over the Wyoming territory, casting long golden shadows across the weathered porch of the Hollister Ranch. Samuel Hollister had just finished his evening rounds, checking the cattle in the north pasture and mending a section of fence that had been threatening to give way for weeks. At 52 years old, his body reminded him daily of the decades he had spent building this land into something worth having, and tonight his bones ached with the particular weariness that came from working alone for too many years. He was reaching for the door handle when he heard the sound of approaching hooves, followed by the distinctive creak of wagon wheels on the hard-packed road that led to his property. Visitors were rare at the Hollister Ranch, and unexpected visitors were rarer still. Samuel had cultivated a reputation for solitude that most folks in the nearby towns of Copper Springs respected without question. He stepped back from the door and turned to face whatever trouble or nuisance was rolling up his drive. The wagon that emerged from the tree line was military, driven by a young soldier in Union blue, whose face bore the exhausted look of someone who had been traveling for days without proper rest. But it was not the soldier who captured Samuel's attention. Sitting beside him on the bench was a girl, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, with copper-red hair braided neatly down her back, and a face full of freckles that stood out against her pale skin. She wore a simple gray dress that had seen better days, and in her small hands she clutched a folded piece of paper as though it contained the secrets of the universe itself. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the porch, and the soldier climbed down with the stiff movements of a man grateful to finally be done with his journey. He approached Samuel with a formal bearing that suggested he was not here for casual conversation. "Mr. Samuel Hollister?" the soldier asked, his voice carrying the clipped tones of official business. "That's me," Samuel replied, his eyes still fixed on the girl who remained seated in the wagon, watching him with an expression that seemed to hold both hope and fear in equal measure. "What brings the army to my door?" The soldier reached into his jacket and produced a sealed envelope bearing military insignia. "I've been tasked with delivering this child into your care, sir, along with these documents. The girl's name is Clara Bennett. Her mother passed away 3 months ago from consumption, and her father—" The soldier hesitated, glancing back at the child as though weighing how much to say in her presence. "Her father was a soldier, sir. He fell at Antietam back in '62. Before he died, he left specific instructions that if anything should happen to his wife, the child was to be brought to you." Samuel felt the ground shift beneath his feet, though he stood perfectly still on his weathered porch. Antietam. The name alone was enough to send cold fingers crawling up his spine. He had spent years trying to forget that blood-soaked field, the screams of dying men, the acrid smell of gunpowder that seemed to cling to his clothes for months afterward. He had come west precisely to escape those memories, to build something clean and new on land that had never known the horror of war. "I think there's been a mistake," Samuel said carefully, his voice steady despite the turmoil building in his chest. "I don't know anyone named Bennett. Never have." The soldier's expression remained professionally neutral. "The documents are quite specific, sir. Private Thomas Bennett named you personally, gave your full name and the location of this ranch. He was apparently very insistent that his daughter be brought here in the event of his wife's death." Before Samuel could respond, the girl had climbed down from the wagon with the nimble grace of childhood and was walking toward him across the dusty ground. She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at him with eyes that were the precise shade of green he had seen only once before in his life. Eyes that belonged to a young soldier he had known for exactly 3 weeks during the bloodiest summer of the war. "Papa said you'd come," the girl said, and her smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "He told Mama stories about you. He said you were the bravest man he ever knew, and that if anything ever happened to him and Mama, you would take care of me." Samuel's throat constricted so tightly he could barely breathe. Thomas Bennett, Tommy, as the men in his unit had called him, a 19-year-old farm boy from Pennsylvania who had been assigned to Samuel's command just 3 weeks before the Battle of Antietam. Tommy, with his easy laugh and his infectious optimism, and his endless stories about the sweetheart waiting for him back home. Tommy, who had taken a Confederate bullet meant for Samuel on that terrible September morning and had died in his arms before the medics could reach them. "I don't understand," Samuel managed, though he understood all too well. He understood that the guilt he had carried for 20 years had just walked up his driveway in the form of a copper-haired child. "Your father and I, we barely knew each other." Clara's smile faltered slightly, but she held her ground with a determination that reminded him painfully of her father. "Papa wrote letters to Mama every day he was away. She kept them all, read them to me when I was little. He wrote about you more than anyone else. He said you saved his life twice before." She trailed off, and Samuel saw the shadow of grief pass across her young face. Before the end. The soldier shifted uncomfortably, clearly eager to complete his duty, and returned to wherever soldiers went when their errands were finished. "Sir, the documents include Private Bennett's last will and testament, notarized and witnessed. He left his daughter in your care specifically, with instructions that she be raised on your ranch if anything should happen to her mother. Mrs. Bennett honored his wishes as long as she lived, but when she became too ill to care for the child, she contacted the Army to fulfill her husband's final request." Samuel looked at the official envelope in the soldier's hand, at the child standing before him with her father's eyes and her father's stubborn hope, and felt something crack open inside of his chest that had been sealed shut for 2 decades. He had never married, never had children of his own. After the war, after watching so many young men die under his command, he had convinced himself that he did not deserve such blessings. He had built his ranch in his solitude as a kind of penance, a way of atoning for all the lives he had failed to save. But Tommy Bennett had apparently seen things differently. Somehow, in those brief weeks they had spent together, that young soldier had looked at Samuel and seen something worth trusting with the most precious thing he would ever have: his daughter, his legacy, his hope for a future he would never live to see. The soldier departed within the hour, leaving behind a small trunk containing Clara's worldly possessions and a stack of documents that Samuel could not bring himself to read. He stood on the porch, watching the wagon disappear down the road, acutely aware of the child standing beside him, her small hand still clutching that folded piece of paper she had been holding since her arrival. The evening air had grown cool, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and wood smoke from the distant town, and still neither of them moved or spoke. Finally, it was Clara who broke the silence. "Are you angry that I came?" The question hit Samuel like a physical blow. He turned to look down at her, at this small person who had traveled hundreds of miles on the strength of a dead man's promise, and felt something twist painfully in his heart. "No," he said, and was surprised to find that he meant it. "I'm not angry. I'm trying to understand." Clara nodded solemnly, as though this was the answer she had expected. "Mama said you might need time. She said that sometimes grown-ups need longer to understand things than children do because they have more memories getting in the way." Despite himself, Samuel felt the corner of his mouth twitch towards something that might have been a smile. "Your mama sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was," Clara agreed, and her voice carried the weight of loss that no child should have to bear. "She was sick for a long time before she died. She had time to teach me things, to make sure I knew what to do when she was gone. She told me about Papa, about how they met at a church social when she was 16 and he was 17. She told me about the farm they were going to buy after the war, about the life they had planned together." Her small fingers tightened on the paper in her hands. "And she told me about you." Samuel gestured toward the door, suddenly aware that they had been standing on the porch like strangers while the temperature continued to drop. "Why don't you come inside? I'll make us something to eat, and you can tell me what your mother said." The interior of the ranch house was sparse but clean, the home of a man who had learned to take care of himself but had never bothered to make his surroundings comfortable for anyone else. Clara looked around with curious eyes, taking in the simple furniture, the stone fireplace, the shelf of books that was Samuel's one concession to luxury. She settled into a chair at the kitchen table while he busied himself with the stove, grateful for something to do with his hands while his mind struggled to process the enormity of what was happening. "Mama said Papa wrote about you in almost every letter," Clara began, her voice soft in the quiet kitchen. "He said you were his commanding officer, but you never acted like you were better than the men under you. He said you learned everyone's names, asked about their families, made sure they had enough to eat before you took anything for yourself. He said the other officers thought you were too soft, but your men would have followed you anywhere." Samuel's hand stilled on the pot he was stirring. He had tried so hard to forget those days, to bury the memories of the men who had trusted him with their lives and paid for that trust with their deaths. Hearing his own actions described through the eyes of a man he had failed to save was almost more than he could bear. "Your father was a good soldier," he said quietly, not turning around. "One of the best I ever served with. He was brave and kind, and he never complained, not even when things got bad. The men loved him." "He loved them too," Clara said. "He wrote about all of them. Private Morrison, who played the harmonica, Sergeant Blackwell, who could make coffee out of anything, Corporal Jensen, who talked about his sweetheart so much that everyone felt like they knew her. Papa said the Army was like a family, and you were the father who held everyone together." Samuel closed his eyes, and for a moment he was back on that blood-soaked field, holding Tommy Bennett's hand as the life drained out of him. The young man had been trying to say something, his lips moving but no sound coming out, and Samuel had leaned close to hear his final words. "Tell her I loved her. Tell her I'm sorry. Promise me, Captain. Promise me you'll look after them if they ever need you." He had made that promise without hesitation, had sworn on everything he held sacred that he would honor Tommy's dying wish. And then he had spent 20 years trying to forget, convincing himself that his promise had been the desperate comfort of a dying man, nothing that would ever actually be called upon. He had been wrong. "The night before the battle," Clara continued, "Papa wrote his last letter to Mama. He told her he was scared, that he had a feeling something bad was going to happen. But he also told her that if anything happened to him, she shouldn't be afraid. He said Captain Hollister would take care of everything. He said you were the kind of man who kept his promises, even when it cost you everything." Samuel finally turned to face her, and he saw that she was holding out the folded paper she had been clutching since her arrival. "This is the letter," she said. "Mama kept it separate from all the others. She said I should give it to you when I found you, so you would understand why Papa trusted you with me." His hands trembled as he took the yellowed paper, worn soft from years of handling. The handwriting was cramped and hurried, the script of a man writing by candlelight in the hours before dawn, knowing that he might not live to see another sunset. Samuel unfolded it carefully, as though it might crumble to dust at his touch, and began to read the words of a ghost. The letter was dated September 16, 1862, the night before the Battle of Antietam. Samuel's eyes moved across the faded ink, and with each word the years fell away until he was standing once again in that muddy camp, surrounded by men who would be dead by nightfall. "My dearest Margaret," the letter began, "tomorrow we march into what the officers are calling the most important battle of the war. I do not know if I will survive it, and so I am writing this letter to tell you the things I may never have the chance to say in person. First, know that I love you more than words can express. Every moment we have spent together has been a gift, and if I fall tomorrow, I will die with your name on my lips and your face in my heart." Samuel had to stop reading for a moment, his vision blurring with tears he had not shed in 20 years. He blinked them back and continued, aware of Clara watching him with those impossibly green eyes. "But I am also writing to tell you about a man named Samuel Hollister. He is my captain, and in the 3 weeks I have served under him, he has become the closest thing I have to a brother. I know that sounds strange, given how short a time we have known each other, but there is something about him that makes you feel safe, even in the middle of this terrible war. He is the kind of man who carries others' burdens on his shoulders without complaint, who puts his men's welfare above his own comfort, who sees the humanity in every soldier regardless of rank or background." Samuel's hands were shaking now, the paper trembling in his grip. He remembered Tommy saying something similar one night around the campfire, his young face earnest in the flickering light. Samuel had brushed off the compliment, uncomfortable with praise he did not feel he deserved. Now those words had come back to haunt him, written proof of a trust he had ultimately failed to honor. 2 days ago, Captain Hollister saved my life. We were on a scouting mission when we stumbled into a Confederate patrol. I froze, Margaret. I was so afraid I could not move, could not think, could not do anything but stand there waiting to die. But Captain Hollister stepped in front of me, drew their fire, and somehow got us both back to safety. He was wounded in the shoulder, but he never complained, never blamed me for my cowardice. He just told me that fear was natural, that every man felt it, and that true courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Samuel remembered that day with painful clarity. The bullet had grazed his shoulder, leaving a scar he still carried. But what he remembered most was the look on Tommy's face afterward, the shame and gratitude warring in his young eyes. Samuel had meant every word he said about courage, had believed it with his whole heart. He had just never been able to apply those words to himself. I tell you this, my love, because I need you to understand why I am about to ask something of you. If I do not survive this war, and if anything should ever happen to you, I want you to find Captain Samuel Hollister. I want you to place our children in his care. I know this seems like a strange request, given that you have never met him, and he does not even know of your existence. But I have looked into this man's eyes, and I have seen his soul. He is good, Margaret. He is honorable, and he will protect our family with his life if we ever need him to. Clara spoke softly from her chair at the table. There's more on the back. Samuel turned the paper over with numb fingers, finding another paragraph of cramped handwriting that seemed even more hurried than the first. I have just learned that we march at dawn. I do not have much time left, so I will say this plainly. I have written to Captain Hollister separately, telling him of you and of my wishes. He has promised me, Margaret, sworn on his honor as an officer and a gentleman, that he will watch over you and any children we might have if the worst should happen. I trust him completely. I trust him with you, with our future, with everything I hold dear, and I am asking you to trust him too. Samuel looked up from the letter, his mind reeling. He wrote to me, he said, his voice hoarse. The night before the battle, I received his letter, but I thought, when he died, I thought it did not matter anymore. I thought my promise was void because there was no one left to keep it to. Clara shook her head slowly. Mama was already carrying me when Papa went to war. He did not know. She did not know herself until after he was gone. By the time she realized, it was too late to tell him. The revelation struck Samuel with the force of a physical blow. Tommy had died not knowing that he would become a father, that the sweetheart he spoke of so constantly was carrying his child. And Margaret had spent 2 decades raising that child alone, honoring her husband's wishes, waiting until the end of her life to fulfill his final request. Why did she wait so long? Samuel asked, though he was not sure he wanted to know the answer. Why did she not come to me sooner? Clara's eyes dropped to her lap, and for the first time since her arrival, she looked like the child she was, small and vulnerable and uncertain. She wanted to, she said quietly. She used to talk about it, about finding you and telling you about me. But she was afraid. She thought maybe you would not want us, that Papa's trust had been misplaced. And she was proud, Mama was. She wanted to prove that she could do it on her own, that she did not need anyone's help. Samuel sank into the chair across from her, the letter still clutched in his hand. But she got sick. The consumption came on fast, Clara confirmed. By the time she realized how bad it was, she did not have the strength to travel. So she wrote to the army instead, asked them to honor Papa's request after she was gone. She looked up at him with those haunting green eyes. She made me promise to be brave, to trust in Papa's judgment, even if you turned out to be different than she hoped. She said that even if you could not love me, you would at least keep me safe. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Samuel could not ignore. This child had traveled across half the country, carrying nothing but a dead man's letter and a dying woman's hope, believing that a stranger would welcome her into his home simply because her father had asked him to. The faith required for such a journey was staggering, and Samuel found himself humbled by it in ways he could not fully articulate. "Your mother was right to trust your father's judgment," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "And your father was right to trust me. I made a promise to him, Clara, and I intend to keep it. You have a home here for as long as you need one." The relief that washed over Clara's face was almost painful to witness. She had been holding herself together with a strength that belied her years, but now Samuel could see the cracks in her composure, the exhaustion and grief that she had been keeping at bay through sheer force of will. Her lower lip trembled slightly, and her eyes grew bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, Mr. Hollister." "Samuel," he corrected gently. "Or Sam, if you prefer. We're family now, Clara. No need for formalities." The word family seemed to break something loose inside her. The tears she had been holding back spilled down her cheeks, and a sob escaped her throat despite her obvious efforts to contain it. Samuel hesitated for only a moment before crossing the distance between them and kneeling beside her chair, gathering her small body into his arms with an awkwardness that spoke of years without human contact. She clung to him with desperate strength, her thin shoulders shaking with the force of her grief. Samuel held her and let her cry, understanding that she had probably not allowed herself this release in months, had been too busy being brave and strong and capable to acknowledge the enormity of her loss. He murmured wordless sounds of comfort, the same sounds he had made to dying soldiers on countless battlefields, and felt his own eyes burn with sympathetic tears. They stayed that way for a long time, the rancher and the orphan, bound together by the memory of a young man who had believed in both of them. When Clara's sobs finally subsided into hiccuping breaths, Samuel released her gently and handed her his handkerchief, watching as she wiped her face with the unconscious practicality of a child accustomed to taking care of herself. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice thick with lingering tears. "Mama always said I should be strong, that crying does not change anything." "Your mama was wrong about that," Samuel replied. "Crying does not change what happened, but it helps us carry the weight of it. There's no shame in grief, Clara. It just means you loved someone enough to miss them when they're gone." She looked at him with a wisdom that seemed far too old for her young face. "Do you cry for the soldiers you lost in the war?" The question caught him off guard, piercing through defenses he had spent decades constructing. He thought about lying, about protecting her from the truth of his weakness, but something in her gaze demanded honesty. "Not as much as I should," he admitted. "I locked that grief away a long time ago because I thought it would destroy me if I let it out. But maybe that was not the right choice. Maybe I've been carrying it wrong all these years." Clara nodded as though this made perfect sense to her. "Mama said grief is like water. If you try to hold it back, it just builds up until it breaks through anyway. But if you let it flow, it finds its own way to the sea." Samuel marveled at the poetry of the sentiment, at the depth of understanding that Margaret Bennett had apparently possessed. He wished suddenly and fiercely that he had known her, that he had honored Tommy's request immediately instead of hiding from it for 2 decades. How different might his life have been if he had allowed himself to be part of this family from the beginning. But such thoughts were useless now. The past could not be changed, only acknowledged and learned from. What mattered was the present, and the child who was looking at him with a mixture of hope and exhaustion that made his heart ache. "You must be tired," he said, rising to his feet and offering her his hand. "Let me show you to your room. It's not much, but it's warm and dry, and tomorrow we can figure out what you need to make it feel more like a home." The room he led her to was small but clean, furnished with a simple bed and a wooden dresser and a window that looked out over the rolling hills of his property. Samuel lit the lamp on the bedside table and turned back the quilts on the bed, movements he had not performed for another person in longer than he could remember. "The outhouse is around back," he said, suddenly aware of all the practical details that came with caring for a child. "And there's a pump in the kitchen if you need water during the night. I'll leave my door open, so just call out if you need anything." Clara stood in the center of the room, her small trunk at her feet, looking around with an expression that Samuel could not quite read. "It's nice," she said finally. "Mama and I lived in a boarding house after she got too sick to work. Our room was not nearly this big. The casual mention of their poverty struck Samuel with guilt he knew was irrational but felt nonetheless. While he had been out here building his solitary life, Tommy's widow and child had been struggling to survive in some cramped boarding house, too proud to ask for help from a stranger who had promised to provide it. "You will never have to worry about that again," he said firmly. "This ranch is not much, but it's solid, and it provides well enough. You will always have a roof over your head and food in your belly. That's my promise to you, Clara, and I keep my promises." She looked at him with her father's eyes, and for a moment Samuel could almost see Tommy standing before him, young and hopeful and full of faith in a future he would never live to see. "I know you do," she said softly. "Papa told me so." The first weeks of Clara's presence on the ranch passed in a blur of adjustment and discovery. Samuel found himself relearning the rhythms of daily life, his solitary routines disrupted by the needs of a child who required meals at regular intervals, supervision during her explorations of the property, and conversation that went beyond the occasional words spoken to his horses. It was exhausting and bewildering and strangely wonderful, this sudden immersion in domesticity after so many years alone. Clara, for her part, threw herself into ranch life with an enthusiasm that surprised them both. She insisted on helping with chores, following Samuel around the property like a determined shadow, asking endless questions about cattle and crops and the thousand small tasks that kept a working ranch functioning. Her questions were intelligent and practical, reflecting the keen mind her father's letters had hinted at, and Samuel found himself enjoying the role of teacher more than he had expected. "Why do you check the fences every day?" she asked one morning as they walked the perimeter of the north pasture together. "Do the cattle really try to escape that often?" Samuel smiled at the question, remembering asking something similar of his own father decades ago. "It's not about escaping. Cattle are curious creatures, and they'll push against anything that looks weak just to see what happens. If you let a fence go too long without maintenance, you'll wake up one morning to find your herd scattered across 3 counties. Clara nodded seriously, absorbing this information with the same intensity she brought to everything. "Mommy used to say that problems are like that too. If you ignore the small ones, they turn into big ones before you know it." "Your mama was a wise woman," Samuel agreed, not for the first time. He had come to understand that Margaret Bennett had been remarkable in her own right, raising a daughter alone while battling poverty and illness, never losing sight of the values she wanted to instill in her child. Clara quoted her mother constantly, small pieces of wisdom that painted a picture of a woman Samuel wished he had known. As October gave way to November, the weather turned cold and sharp, carrying the promise of the harsh winter to come. Samuel began preparing the ranch for the long months ahead, laying in supplies, reinforcing the barn against the wind, making sure the cattle had adequate shelter. Clara helped where she could, her small hands surprisingly capable as she learned to stack firewood and mend harnesses and perform the countless tasks that frontier life demanded. It was during one of these preparation days that trouble first appeared on the horizon, riding up the road in the form of 3 men on horseback. Samuel spotted them from the barn, where he and Clara were organizing supplies, and something in their bearing made him reach instinctively for the rifle he kept propped against the wall. "Stay here," he told Clara, his voice calm but firm. "Don't come out until I tell you it's safe." Her eyes went wide with fear, but she nodded and retreated deeper into the barn, hiding behind a stack of hay bales where she could watch without being seen. Samuel stepped out into the yard, the rifle held loosely at his side, and waited for the riders to approach. The man in the lead was familiar, though Samuel could not immediately place him. He was perhaps 40 years old, with a hard face and calculating eyes that swept across the property with undisguised greed. His companions were younger, rougher, the kind of men who hired out their muscle to anyone willing to pay. "Samuel Hollister," the lead rider said as he reined in his horse a dozen feet away. "Been a long time." And then Samuel remembered. Ezra Thorne, a supply officer he had served with briefly during the war. They had never been friends, had barely been acquaintances, but Samuel recalled hearing rumors about Thorne's dealings, whispers of supplies that went missing, of profits made from the misery of soldiers who needed those supplies to survive. "Thorn," Samuel acknowledged, his grip tightening on the rifle. "What brings you to my ranch?" Thorn's smile was thin and unpleasant. "Heard you'd settled out here after the war. Built yourself quite a spread from what I can see. Must have done well for yourself." "Well enough," Samuel replied cautiously. "What do you want?" "Straight to business, just like always." Thorn chuckled, though the sound held no warmth. "Fine, I'll get to the point. I've been buying up land in these parts, putting together a cattle operation that's going to make me rich. Your ranch sits right in the middle of the grazing route I need. I'm prepared to make you a fair offer for it." Samuel's jaw tightened. He had heard about men like Thorn, speculators who swooped into frontier territories and tried to consolidate land through any means necessary. Some of them were honest businessmen, but most were not, and the predatory gleam in Thorn's eyes left little doubt about which category he fell into. "The ranch isn't for sale," Samuel said flatly. "Never has been, never will be." Thorn's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "That's a shame. I was hoping we could do this the civilized way. But I'm a patient man, Hollister. I've learned that everyone has a price, and everyone has a pressure point. It's just a matter of finding them." His gaze drifted toward the barn, and Samuel felt ice form in his stomach. He shifted his position slightly, placing himself more firmly between the Thorn and the building where Clara was hiding. "I think you should leave now," Samuel said quietly, but there was steel beneath the words. "And I think you should forget about this ranch. Find another route for your cattle." Thorn studied him for a long moment, something calculating moving behind his eyes. Then he smiled again, that same thin, unpleasant expression that made Samuel's skin crawl. "Like I said, I'm a patient man. We'll talk again soon, Hollister. Real soon." He wheeled his horse around and rode away, his two companions following close behind. Samuel watched until they disappeared over the ridge, his rifle still gripped in white-knuckled hands, a cold dread settling into his bones that had nothing to do with the November wind. Clara emerged from the barn the moment Samuel gave the all-clear, her face pale but her expression determined. She had heard everything, Samuel realized, had watched the entire exchange from her hiding place among the hay bales. The fear in her eyes was evident, but so was something else, a stubborn courage that reminded him forcefully of her father. "That man is dangerous," she said quietly. "I could see it in his face. He's not going to give up just because you said no." Samuel wished he could disagree, could offer her some reassurance that the encounter had been nothing more than an unpleasant inconvenience. But he had learned long ago that children deserved honesty, even when the truth was frightening. "You're right," he admitted. "Men like Thorn don't accept defeat easily. We'll need to be careful for a while, stay alert, make sure we're not caught off guard." "What did he mean about pressure points?" Clara asked, her brow furrowed with worry. "Is he going to try to hurt you?" The question struck Samuel with unexpected force. He had assumed Thorn's veiled threat referred to him, to whatever leverage might be used against a solitary rancher who had no family, no connections, nothing to lose except the land itself. But now he understood with sickening clarity what Thorn had actually seen when his gaze drifted toward the barn. He had seen Clara. He had seen Samuel's vulnerability given form, a child who could be threatened, harmed, used as leverage against a man who had seemed untouchable only moments before. "He's not going to hurt anyone," Samuel said firmly, though his heart was racing with fear he dared not show. "I won't let him. That's a promise, Clara, and you know I keep my promises." She nodded slowly, accepting his words with the trust that still amazed him after all these weeks. "What do we do now?" It was a practical question, the kind her mother would have asked, and Samuel found himself grateful for her clear-headedness in the face of danger. "First, we finish our preparations for winter. Whatever Thorn is planning, it'll be harder for him to act once the snow comes. Then we start being more careful about security. I'll teach you what to do if strangers approach the ranch, where to hide, how to signal for help if I'm not nearby." The conversation that followed was difficult but necessary. Samuel explained the harsh realities of frontier life, the dangers that could come from men who wanted what others had built, the importance of vigilance and preparation. Clara listened with solemn attention, asking questions when she did not understand, accepting his instructions without complaint. By the time they finished, the sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. That night, Samuel sat at the kitchen table after Clara had gone to bed, cleaning his rifle by lamplight and thinking about the past. Ezra Thorne had not been a good man during the war, but he had not been actively dangerous either. Just another opportunist making profit from chaos. Something had changed in the intervening years, hardened him into the predator who had ridden up to Samuel's ranch with violence barely concealed behind his civilized smile. The sound of footsteps made him look up, and he found Clara standing in the doorway, her nightgown white in the lamplight, her copper hair loose around her shoulders. She looked impossibly young and fragile, and Samuel felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, settling into the chair across from him. "I keep thinking about what that man said, about finding pressure points." Samuel set down the rifle and gave her his full attention. "What about it?" Clara was quiet for a moment, her green eyes troubled. "I'm your pressure point now, aren't I? Before I came, you didn't have anyone he could threaten, but now you have me, and that makes you vulnerable." The insight was startlingly accurate for a child her age, and Samuel felt his heart constrict with a complicated mixture of pride and sorrow. She should not have to think about such things, should not have to understand the terrible calculus of leverage and vulnerability that governed the darker aspects of human nature. "You're not a weakness," he said carefully. "You're a reason to fight harder, to be smarter, to make sure nothing happens to either of us. There's a difference." "Is there?" Her voice was small, uncertain. "Mama always said I was the reason she kept going, even when things got really hard. But sometimes I wondered if her life would have been easier without me. If she could have gotten better care, lived in a nicer place, not worked herself sick trying to provide for both of us." Samuel reached across the table and took her small hand in his, marveling at how fragile her bones felt beneath his calloused fingers. "Listen to me, Clara. Your mother loved you more than anything in this world. Whatever sacrifices she made them gladly because you were worth it to her, and I feel the same way. Having you here hasn't made my life harder. It's made it meaningful in a way it hasn't been for 20 years. Tears glistened in her eyes, but she blinked them back with the practiced control of a child who had learned early that crying solved nothing. "Papa wrote that you carried guilt about the soldiers who died under your command. He said you blamed yourself for things that weren't your fault." The observation caught Samuel off guard, penetrating defenses he had thought were impenetrable. "Your father saw too much in those 3 weeks we spent together." "He saw the truth," Clara corrected gently. "And he wanted you to know that none of those deaths were your fault. He wrote to Mama that you did everything humanly possible to protect your men, that you put their lives above your own every single time. He said the only person who didn't see that was you." Samuel stared at her, at this child who carried her father's words like sacred texts, and felt something shift inside his chest. For 20 years he had punished himself for failing to save the men under his command. And for 20 years, one of those men had been trying to tell him, through letters he had written to the woman he loved, that there was nothing to forgive. The weeks that followed brought the first snows of winter, blanketing the ranch in white and providing a temporary respite from the threat that lurked beyond its borders. Ezra Thorne had not returned since his initial visit, but Samuel remained vigilant, his rifle always within reach, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of approaching riders. Clara had adapted to the new reality with remarkable resilience, learning the signals and hiding places Samuel had taught her, never straying far from the house without permission. Despite the underlying tension, life on the ranch continued its seasonal rhythms. Samuel taught Clara to read cattle tracks in the snow, to predict weather changes from the behavior of animals, to identify the different calls of birds that wintered in the territory. She absorbed everything with eager curiosity, her quick mind making connections that sometimes surprised even her teacher. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and read aloud to each other from Samuel's collection of books. Clara favored adventure stories, tales of exploration and discovery that transported her imagination to places far beyond the snow-covered prairie. Samuel found himself drawn to poetry he had not touched in years, the verses of Tennyson and Longfellow awakening something that had been dormant in his soul since before the war. It was during one of these evening readings that Clara asked the question Samuel had been dreading since her arrival. They had just finished a chapter of Robinson Crusoe, and she was staring into the fire with a contemplative expression that reminded him painfully of her father. "Samuel," she said quietly, "will you tell me about the day my papa died?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy with significance. Samuel had known this moment would come eventually, had tried to prepare himself for it, but nothing could truly ready him for the weight of that question from the child of the man he had failed to save. "Are you sure you want to know?" he asked gently. "It's not a happy story." Clara turned to face him, her green eyes steady and determined. "Mama couldn't tell me because she wasn't there. The army letter just said he died bravely in battle, but that doesn't tell me anything real. I need to know, Samuel. I need to understand what happened to him." Samuel set aside the book he had been holding and took a deep breath, reaching back through the years to that terrible September morning. "The Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest single day of the war," he began slowly. "More men died in those few hours than in any other battle before or since. We knew it was going to be bad going in, could feel it in the air like electricity before a storm." Clara listened without interrupting, her small body perfectly still as Samuel continued. "Your father was in my unit, part of the advance that pushed toward the Confederate lines at dawn. He was scared, we all were, but he never showed it. He told jokes to the younger soldiers, helped calm their nerves, made them believe we could get through it together." Samuel's voice grew thick with memory. "I was proud of him that morning, proud of the man he was becoming." "What happened?" Clara whispered. "The fighting was worse than anything we'd seen before. Men falling everywhere, the noise so loud you couldn't hear yourself think. We pushed forward anyway because that's what soldiers do. And then—" Samuel paused, gathering the strength to continue. "Then I saw a Confederate sharpshooter taking aim at me from behind a stone wall. I was exposed, couldn't reach cover in time. I knew I was going to die." His hands were trembling now, the memories as vivid as if they had happened yesterday. "Your father saw it too, and without hesitation, without thinking about himself at all, he threw himself in front of me. The bullet that was meant for my heart hit him instead." Tears were streaming down Clara's face now, but she made no move to wipe them away. "Did he suffer?" "No," Samuel said firmly, though he was not entirely certain it was true. "He was conscious for a few minutes, long enough to speak to me. He told me to take care of you and your mother. He told me he wasn't afraid. And then he was gone, peaceful as falling asleep." Clara was silent for a long moment, processing the terrible truth she had asked to hear. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite her tears. "He saved your life." "Yes, and I've spent 20 years wishing he hadn't. Wishing I had been faster, more alert, that I had seen the danger in time to save us both." Samuel's own eyes were wet now, the grief he had locked away finally breaking free. "Your father was the better man, Clara. He deserved to live, to come home to your mother, to meet you and raise you and grow old, watching you become a woman. Instead, he gave all of that up for me." Clara rose from her chair and crossed the space between them, climbing into Samuel's lap the way she might have climbed into her father's if fate had been kinder. She wrapped her arms around his neck and held on tight, offering comfort even as she received it. "Papa made a choice," she said against his shoulder. "He chose to save someone he believed in, someone he trusted to keep his promises. He wouldn't want you to spend your life feeling guilty about it. He would want you to live well, to be happy, to take care of me the way he knew you would." Samuel held her close, this precious child who carried her father's heart and her mother's wisdom, and felt something begin to heal inside him that had been broken for 2 decades. The guilt would not disappear overnight, might never fully disappear at all. But for the first time since Antietam, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps, With time and love and the grace of a child's forgiveness, he might learn to carry it differently. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the harsh landscape in soft, white silence. And inside the warm ranch house, a man and a girl clung to each other, bound together by loss and love and the enduring power of promises kept. The trouble came on a bitter January morning when the temperature had dropped so low that ice crystals hung in the air like frozen diamonds. Samuel had gone to check on the cattle in the south pasture, leaving Clara with strict instructions to stay inside and keep the doors locked until his return. It was a routine he had established weeks ago, a precaution born of vigilance rather than any specific threat. But on this morning, the precaution proved tragically insufficient. He was halfway back to the house when he saw the smoke rising from the direction of the barn, a thick black column climbing into the pale winter sky. Samuel spurred his horse into a gallop, his heart hammering against his ribs as he raced toward home. The barn was fully engulfed by the time he arrived, flames licking at the wooden walls despite the snow that blanketed the ground, and standing in front of the house were 3 men on horseback. Ezra Thorne sat in the center, his thin smile visible even from a distance. His 2 companions flanked him like wolves guarding their leader, and between them, held firmly in the grip of one of the rough men, was Clara. Her face was pale with terror, but her eyes found Samuel's across the distance, and he saw the apology in them, the guilt of a child who believed she had somehow failed him. Samuel reined in his horse a dozen feet away, his rifle already in his hands, though he knew with sickening certainty that he could not use it without risking Clara's life. Thorne had found his pressure point, had exploited the vulnerability that Samuel had hoped to protect. The game had changed irrevocably in the space of a single morning. "Hollister," Thorne called out pleasantly, as though they were meeting for a friendly chat rather than a hostage negotiation. "I told you we'd talk again soon. I'm a man of my word. Let her go." Samuel's voice was steady, but inside he was screaming, calculating angles and distances, searching desperately for some way to save Clara without getting her killed. "This is between you and me. She's got nothing to do with it." "On the contrary, she has everything to do with it." Thorne's smile widened. "You see, I've done my research since our last conversation. Learned some interesting things about you, Captain Hollister, about the war, about the men you served with, about the promises you made." He gestured toward Clara with casual cruelty. "This little girl is the daughter of a soldier who died saving your life, which means she represents everything you've been trying to atone for these past 20 years. Your guilt made flesh and blood." Samuel felt the words like physical blows, each one striking at wounds he had thought were finally beginning to heal. Thorne had done his homework, had somehow uncovered the history that bound Samuel to Clara, and was now using that knowledge as a weapon more devastating than any gun. "What do you want?" Samuel asked, though he already knew the answer. "The same thing I wanted before, your land. Sign it over to me, and the girl goes free. Refuse and, well..." Thorne shrugged with theatrical regret. "The frontier is a dangerous place. Children disappear all the time. Tragic, really, but hardly unusual." Clara made a small sound of fear, quickly suppressed, and Samuel felt rage building in his chest like steam in a boiler. This man, this coward who threatened children to get what he wanted, represented everything Samuel had fought against during the war. The bullies, the opportunists, the men who saw others only as tools to be used and discarded. "If I sign over the ranch," Samuel said slowly, "how do I know you'll keep your word? How do I know you won't hurt her anyway once you have what you want?" Thorne laughed, a cold sound that carried no humor. "You don't. But you don't have any other options, do you? Take the chance, or watch the girl die right here in front of you. Your choice, Captain." The use of his military rank was deliberate, Samuel knew, a reminder of all the men who had died under his command, all the promises he had failed to keep. Thorne was trying to break him psychologically, to use his guilt and grief as weapons against him. And it was working. But then Clara spoke, her voice thin but steady despite her terror. "Don't do it, Samuel. Don't give him what he wants." The man holding her tightened his grip, and she winced but did not cry out. Her green eyes, her father's eyes, met Samuel's across the distance, and in them he saw something that took his breath away. He saw trust. Absolute, unwavering trust that he would find a way to save her without surrendering everything they had built together. "Brave girl," Thorne observed with mock admiration. "Takes after her father, from what I hear. He died protecting you too, didn't he, Captain? Seems like a pattern. People keep sacrificing themselves for a man who can't seem to save anyone." The words were meant to wound, and they did. But they also ignited something in Samuel that had been dormant for 2 decades, a fierce determination that had once made him the officer his men would follow anywhere. He had spent 20 years punishing himself for the soldiers he could not save. He had accepted this child into his home as a form of penance, a debt he could never fully repay. But Clara was not his penance. She was not a symbol of his guilt or a reminder of his failures. She was a person, a child who deserved to live and grow and become the remarkable woman her parents had hoped she would be. And Samuel would be damned if he let Ezra Thorne take that away from her. "You want to make a deal?" Samuel said, his voice dropping to the quiet tone that soldiers who had served under him would have recognized immediately. "Fine, let's make a deal, but not the one you're expecting." Thorne's smile flickered with uncertainty for the first time. "What are you talking about?" Samuel lowered his rifle slowly, placing it on the ground in front of him. Then he dismounted from his horse and began walking toward Thorne, his hands raised but his eyes never leaving the man who held Clara's life in his grasp. "You want to fight?" Samuel said quietly. "Then let's fight, you and me, right here, right now. No guns, no hostages, just 2 men settling their differences the old-fashioned way. Winner takes everything." For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sounds were the crackling of the burning barn and the harsh breathing of men facing an unexpected turn of events. Thorne stared at Samuel with an expression that shifted from surprise to calculation to something that might have been fear, quickly suppressed behind his mask of arrogance. "You're bluffing," Thorne said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "You'd risk the girl's life on a fist fight?" "I'm not risking anything." Samuel continued his slow advance, his hands still raised, his eyes locked on Thorne's face. "You came here to break me, to use my guilt against me. But you made a mistake, Thorne. You assumed that guilt made me weak. It doesn't. It makes me dangerous, because I've got nothing left to lose and everything to fight for." He stopped 10 feet from where Thorne sat on his horse, close enough to see the sweat beading on the man's forehead despite the bitter cold. The 2 hired men shifted nervously, their hands hovering near their weapons, uncertain how to respond to a situation that had suddenly departed from their employer's script. "Here's what's going to happen," Samuel continued, his voice carrying the command authority he had not used since the war. "You're going to let the girl go. Then you and I are going to settle this between ourselves. Your men can watch, make sure it's fair. Winner walks away with everything, the ranch, the girl, the whole territory, if that's what you want. Loser doesn't walk away at all." Thorne laughed, but the sound was hollow and uncertain. "You're twice my age, Hollister. You really think you can beat me in a fight?" "I think you've never faced anyone who wasn't already beaten before the fight started." Samuel's voice was ice. "I think you've spent your whole life bullying people who couldn't fight it back, taking what wasn't yours from people too weak or too scared to stop you. But I'm not weak, and I'm not scared. I'm just a man who made a promise to a dying soldier 20 years ago, and I intend to keep it." Something flickered in Thorne's eyes at those words, a recognition perhaps that he had underestimated his opponent, had mistaken grief for weakness and solitude for vulnerability. He glanced at his men, then at Clara, then back at Samuel, calculating odds and outcomes with the cold pragmatism of a man who had built his fortune on such calculations. "Fine," he said finally, swinging down from his horse with an agility that belied his age. "You want to die like a fool, I'll oblige you. Marcus, let the girl go. Keep your gun on her. If Hollister tries anything funny, shoot her." The man holding Clara released his grip on her arm, but drew his pistol and aimed it at her back. Clara stumbled forward a few steps, then stopped, her eyes wide with fear as she looked between Samuel and the gun pointed at her spine. "It's going to be all right," Samuel told her quietly. "I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" She nodded, a small jerky motion that broke his heart with its courage. "I trust you." Thorn had removed his coat and was rolling up his sleeves, revealing forearms that were surprisingly muscular for a man who had spent most of his career behind a desk. He moved into a fighting stance that suggested some training, perhaps boxing lessons from his youth, or brawling experience from his less respectable years. Samuel did not bother with such preparations. He simply stood there waiting, his hands loose at his sides, his body relaxed but ready. He had not fought another man in 20 years, but some skills never truly faded, especially those learned in the crucible of war. Thorn attacked first, a quick jab aimed at Samuel's face, followed by a sweeping hook toward his ribs. Samuel blocked the jab and sidestepped the hook, using Thorn's momentum to throw him off balance. The younger man stumbled but recovered quickly, circling warily, his respect for his opponent visibly increasing. "Not bad for an old man," Thorn admitted, his breath already coming faster. "But I've got time on my side. All I have to do is wear you down." He attacked again, more cautiously this time, probing Samuel's defenses with quick combinations that tested his reflexes and endurance. Samuel weathered the assault, blocking and dodging, conserving his energy, while Thorn expended his in increasingly frustrated attacks. The turning point came when Thorn overcommitted to a powerful right cross, putting all his weight behind a blow intended to end the fight. Samuel ducked under the punch and drove his fist into Thorn's solar plexus with the precision of a man who had learned anatomy on the battlefield. Thorn doubled over, gasping for breath, and Samuel followed with a devastating uppercut that snapped his head back and sent him crashing to the frozen ground. For a moment, Thorn lay there stunned, blood streaming from his nose, his eyes unfocused. Then he reached into his boot and pulled out a knife, lunging toward Samuel with desperate fury. Samuel caught Thorn's wrist as the blade slashed toward his throat, twisting sharply until he heard the crack of bone and Thorn's scream of pain. The knife fell from nerveless fingers, and Samuel drove his knee into Thorn's chest, pinning him to the ground with one hand wrapped around his throat. "It's over," Samuel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Call off your men, or I finish this right now." Thorn's eyes bulged with fear and pain, the arrogance finally stripped away to reveal the coward beneath. "Marcus," he choked out, "lower your weapon. It's done. We're leaving." The hired man hesitated, looking between his fallen employer and the gun in his hand. Then he holstered the weapon and backed toward his horse, his companion following close behind. Within minutes, they had loaded Thorn onto his horse and were riding away, leaving Samuel and Clara alone in front of the burning barn. Samuel stayed on his feet just long enough to watch them disappear over the ridge. Then his knees buckled, and he sank to the frozen ground, the adrenaline draining away to reveal the exhaustion and pain beneath. Clara was beside him in an instant, her small arms wrapping around him, her tears hot against his cold skin. "You did it," she whispered. "You saved me." Samuel held her close, this precious child he had nearly lost, and felt something settle into place in his heart that had been broken for 20 years. Spring came early to the Wyoming Territory that year, melting the snow and coaxing green shoots from the frozen earth weeks before anyone expected them. Samuel stood on the porch of the rebuilt barn, watching Clara chase butterflies through the meadow beyond the house, her copper hair streaming behind her like a banner of flame. She was laughing, the pure, unself-conscious laughter of a child who had finally found a place where she belonged, and the sound filled Samuel's heart with a joy he had thought himself incapable of feeling. The months since Thorn's defeat had brought changes to the ranch and to the man who owned it. The barn had been rebuilt with help from neighbors Samuel had barely known before Clara's arrival, men and women who had heard about the confrontation and had come to offer their support without it being asked. It seemed that standing up to a bully had earned him a respect that years of solitary ranching never had, and the community that had once viewed him as a recluse now welcomed him as one of their own. But the greater changes had occurred inside Samuel himself, in the quiet corners of his soul where guilt and grief had festered for 2 decades. Clara had become more than his ward, more than the fulfillment of a promise made to a dying soldier. She had become his daughter in every way that mattered, the center of a life that had been empty for far too long. Her presence had healed wounds he had thought would never close, had taught him that redemption was not about punishing yourself for past failures, but about building something meaningful from the ashes of your mistakes. "Samuel," Clara called from the meadow, waving something in her hand. "Come look what I found." He walked toward her through the spring sunshine, marveling as he did every day at how naturally she had claimed her place in his life. She was holding a bird's nest, carefully cradled in her small palms, showing him the 3 tiny blue eggs nestled inside. "A bluebird nest," he said, kneeling beside her to examine her discovery. "They must have built it in the old fence post by the creek. Good eye, Clara." She beamed at his praise, then gently returned the nest to its hiding place, understanding without being told that wild things needed to be left undisturbed. It was one of countless lessons she had absorbed during her months on the ranch, practical wisdom that would serve her well in the years to come. "Samuel," she said as they walked back toward the house together, "do you think Papa can see us? Do you think he knows I'm happy here?" The question caught him off guard, as her questions often did, piercing straight to the heart of matters that adults preferred to leave unexamined. Samuel considered his answer carefully, wanting to give her truth rather than comfortable platitudes. "I think your father knew you'd be happy here before either of us did," he said finally. "He saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself, believed in me when I'd given up believing in anything. And I think wherever he is now, he's proud of the young woman you're becoming." Clara slipped her hand into his, a gesture that had become natural between them over the months. "I'm glad he sent me to you," she said simply. "I was so scared when Mama died, scared that I'd be alone forever. But Papa knew. He knew you'd take care of me." They reached the porch and sat together on the steps, looking out over the land that had become their shared home. The cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, and somewhere a meadow lark was singing its complicated song of territory and love. Everything felt right in a way that Samuel had never experienced before, a sense of completeness that he had not known he was missing until it arrived. "Clara," he said, "I need to tell you something important, something I should have said a long time ago." She looked up at him with those green eyes, her father's eyes, waiting with the patience she had learned from her remarkable mother. "When you first came here, I thought of you as a duty, an obligation I had to fulfill because of a promise I made to your father. But that's not how I think of you anymore." He paused, searching for words that could express what he felt. "You're my family now, Clara. My daughter, in every way that counts. And I want you to know that no matter what happens, no matter how many years pass or how much things change, you will always have a home with me." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling, that radiant smile that transformed her freckled face into something beautiful. "I already knew that," she said softly. "I knew it the first time you held me when I was crying. Papa was right about you, Samuel. He was right about everything." She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her shoulders, holding her close as they watched the sun climb higher into the spring sky. In the distance, a red-tailed hawk circled lazily on the thermal currents, and the prairie stretched endlessly toward horizons that no longer seemed lonely or forbidding. Samuel thought about Tommy Bennett, about the young soldier who had given his life for a man he barely knew, trusting that his sacrifice would not be in vain. He thought about Margaret, the woman who had kept her husband's faith alive through 2 decades of hardship, who had sent her daughter across the country on the strength of a promise made before Clara was even born. And he thought about himself, about the journey that had brought him from that blood-soaked battlefield to this sun-drenched porch, from a man consumed by guilt to a father filled with love. The path had been long and painful, but it had led him here, to this moment, to this child who had taught him that redemption was not about forgetting the past, but about honoring it by living fully in the present. "Papa said you'd come," Clara had told him on that first day. And she had been right. Samuel had come, not just to the porch to meet her, but to himself, to the man he was always meant to be. The hawk dipped its wings and soared toward the mountains, carrying with it the last remnants of Samuel's grief. Below, a man and his daughter sat together in the sunshine, watching it go.